Storytelling Revisited: Advantages of Abstraction. Back in July of 2022, I did a musing on storytelling and presented the utility of unfolding a model as a story as opposed to simply giving someone a model like this and attempting to get them to absorb whatever it is that it's supposed to mean. And so this particular model, which is really not that complex, imagine one that's 5 or 10 times as complex as this one, you can go through and you can unfold and you can explain this to someone piece by piece by piece as you build out the story. And by the end of actually explaining that, it's hoped that the person will have at least some semblance of understanding of what the developer thought they came to understand by putting all these relationships together. Though it's still, even if you unfold it as a story and get a sense of what all the pieces are, there's still a question of what's it mean? I mean, we have a tendency to get lost in the trees and have no sense of the forest. So if the person who puts a model like this together actually thinks about the aspects of it in terms of what the hell is it that it actually represents for this particular model, which I had an amazing aha moment to understand what I thought this meant. If I look at this, I can say that, okay, there's an aspect of this particular model that tries to deal with unwanted pregnancy, which promotes unwanted births, which promotes more activities to diminish the unwantedness. So you have a stabilizing balancing loop. And if you then look at this, it says that that balancing loop actually represents this part of the other model. So there's actually 4 loops that represent that particular piece. And then you say that there's a portion of the model which is meant to avoid birth, so that the unwanted births promotes activity to avoid the unwanted births, which is, doing abortions, which then diminishes the number of unwanted births. And that's an approach to dealing with that situation, which is another stabilizing balancing loop. And if you look at it, this loop actually represents an aspect of this model, so that there's another 5 loops in that model that are all essentially attempting to avoid birth. The last piece is there's an aspect of it that the unwanted pregnancy promotes action to avoid the unwanted pregnancy, which diminishes the unwanted pregnancies, and you have another stabilizing balancing loop. And that is represented by this portion of that model, which is another 4 loops, 2 balancing loops and 2 reinforcing loops. As it turns out, though, if you once you do this abstraction and look at it, you realize that the activity to diminish unwantedness actually diminishes the activity to avoid unwanted pregnancy, which actually increases the unwanted pregnancy, and you end up with a vicious reinforcing structure moving you in a direction that you absolutely don't want to go. And what it actually creates is an accommodate births shifting the burden structure, where focusing on the short-term activity to diminish the unwantedness actually creates a vicious reinforcing structure, which promotes more unwanted pregnancy, requiring more activity to accommodate births. And you're simply focusing on the short term and making the long term worse. In the other instance, the avoid unwanted births causes diminishing the activity to avoid unwanted pregnancy, which increases the likelihood of having unwanted pregnancy, and you have another vicious reinforcing loop taking you in a direction that you don't want to go. And that ends up creating another shifting the burden structure, whereby focusing on the short-term activity to deal with the unwanted births actually diminishes the longer-term better solution, which is avoiding the unwanted pregnancies to begin with. So when looking at this, there's a piece here that's really sort of struck me as odd, because this relationship and this relationship are actually not in the previous model. It was not until I figured out the abstraction for that model that I realized that these pieces are missing, and trying to figure out how to put these two pieces on that model is really difficult. And then when I got to this point, the question was, well, how many other situations are there for which multiple shifting the burden structures mushed together actually represent the situation? If I think about the nuclear weapons, we can spend our time figuring out how to accommodate the fact that we have lots of them, or we can spend time figuring out how to avoid the use of them, or we can figure out how to avoid the existence of them and get rid of them altogether, so that these two are no longer issues. And I think that as I think about it, I'm probably going to come up with numerous other situations or scenarios where this is a frequently recurring structure. So this is also a nice example of something that you can do in Kumu, because what I've done is, this is the detailed model. This is actually another map in the same model, and it simply has pieces which are links to cause segments of the more detailed model to display in light boxes, so that if somebody then asks, well, okay, if this is multiple pieces of the other model, what are they? And you can drill down on the other model to say, okay, that represents these four loops, which one can then go ahead and look at in sequence and understand the various pieces. So hope you found this interesting, and if you have thoughts about other situations where this is a relevant structure, which might be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 shifting the burden structures mushed together, let me know in the comments. I'd really like to hear from you. Thank you. Bye.